So we need to talk about something explosive that has been emerging inside the Ukrainian government, specifically corruption and the scandals that are going to impact the front lines. Golden toilet seats in luxury apartments, bags of cash stacked as bricks, and secret audio recordings of officials discussing how to move this illicit money out of the country, while their Ukrainian brethren are defending it, and the city sit in darkness from daily power cuts. You see, this isn't an old scandal from, say, the Yanukovych era. This is happening right now inside Zelensky's own circle, and it's triggered one of the biggest anti-corruption crises of his presidency. And here is the uncomfortable truth that we should get out of the way immediately. If mishandled, this would be more dangerous to Ukraine's leadership than anything that happens far in the east. Because ultimately, if Ukraine can't get a hold of this, it affects their potential support from the West, EU membership, and more. So in this video, I wanted to break down what investigators have uncovered, why Zelensky has been dithering, how this crisis is threatening Kiev's political stability politically and externally, and what could happen next when it comes to what we hear from the Kremlin and more.
This is the Global Gambit.
How's it going, everyone? Welcome back to the channel where we cover geopolitics, international relations, and economic statecraft with a particular emphasis on the Russia-Ukraine war. Now, many of you who follow this much more in-depthly will be aware that over the past week, Ukraine's Independent Anti-Corruption Bureau, or known as the NABU or NABU, dropped a vast trove of evidence, leaked recording, orchestrated kickback schemes, and proof that senior figures inside the government were taking money intended to protect power stations from Russian attacks, Ukrainians from missile strikes. But before going further into this, I'm very curious to hear what you feel about this. Is it overhyped or an illustration of the shortcomings that still need to be drastically addressed? And if so, how? Let me know in the comments. Now, before getting into the nuts and bolts, I want to be upfront. Coming from this region, it's important to ground this story in reality, not mythology. What I mean by that is Ukraine is not and never has claimed to be something flawless, a beacon of pure, transparent governance. It shares the same imperial and Soviet-era inheritance as Russia in the sense that they are the same bureaucratic culture, the same informal networks, the same structural temptations. Anyone pretending the two countries are naturally worlds apart, at least in the area of lasting corruption, either hasn't studied the region honestly or is pushing a narrative with such a reluctance to ever recognize the shortcomings when they do occur. Because if you want to progress, you have to acknowledge your mistakes. And with that last point in mind, this is the crucial counter one. Ukraine is moving. It is changing. And unlike Russia, which has regressed, it has spent Ukraine decades building institutions designed to expose and confront corruption rather than conceal it. That's why Ukraine has climbed to around 105th on Transparency International's Corruption Perception Index, an organization that is dedicated to focusing on internal corruption and instability, versus Russia, which has gone down to 154th, thinking further since Putin's full-scale invasion. Indeed, this divergence frames everything that we will discuss. For example, especially on EU membership, mentioned constantly in discussions in diplomatic circles. And I'll say this briefly and watch to the end to find out properly later on, that this is why Ukraine also isn't going to be fast-tracked. Not because Ukraine is unworthy, but because durable anti-corruption reforms take time, pressure, and institutional consolidation, consistency. Fast-tracking them removes all three parameters. But more on why that matters and why it's in Ukraine's own interests later on. You see, because when investigators have traced the scheme's organisers of this latest set of corruption, the trail led uncomfortably close to Zelensky's long-term business associates, people from his pre-politics world. At first, Zelensky tried to contain it quietly, but the story has detonated very quickly. To consider this latest set of revelations, let's look at some historical context. You see, after the 2014 Maidan Revolution, Ukraine built something rare in the post-Soviet region: independent anti-corruption institutions designed to prevent especially presidential interference. NABU, or SAPAO, the High Anti-Corruption Court, all these were structured with Western oversight, were created precisely because corruption wasn't some unexpected aberration. It was a core feature of how the state had worked for decades. Ukraine is not and has never been a bastion of perfection, as I say. In many ways, its pre-2014 corruption environment was much worse than Russia's. Deeper oligarchic capture, weaker institutions, a political class used to trade influence for cash. So in that sense, the same imperial and Soviet inheritance, the same bureaucratic culture, the same habits of informal deals and shady networks existed, and if anything, proliferated much better. Putin's removal of some of the oligarchic class in the early 2000s actually improved Russia's standings in ironic ways. The crucial difference, though, is not that Ukrainians are somehow morally superior, it's that after 2014, Ukraine chose to start building independent enforcement bodies. Russia chose to dismantle them, and that's what happens in this scandal and why it matters so much. It isn't about pretending Ukraine is clean, it's about whether the country continues to move away from that shared post-Soviet model or slides back towards it. You see, over the summer, Zelensky's team tested the system with a power move, attempting to place Nabu and Sapu under the prosecutor general, effectively under centralized or presidential control. Even in wartime, Ukrainians took to the streets. As we remember covering in the channel earlier then, Western partners also warned Kiev that support could be jeopardized, and Zelensky eventually backed down. But behind the scenes, Nabu was finalizing a 15-month investigation into people close to the president. Evidence that is too big to bury. And so what exactly was found? Well, they released this probe publicly. More than 70 searches, 5 arrests, over 1,000 hours of wiretaps, a corruption network running through Ukraine's entire energy sector. Officials and intermediaries allegedly forced suppliers to Ukraine's nuclear energy company, Emergence, to pay 10 to 15% kickbacks on major contracts. Some contracts were for fortifying substations against Russian drone and missile strikes. The alleged organizer, therefore, of all of this was Timur Mindich, a wealthy businessman, longtime friend, and also former entertainment partner of Zelensky's. Investigators say that around 100 million in illicit funds passed through his office, described as a, quote, laundry room for criminal proceeds. Mindich was tipped off and fled Ukraine hours before the raids. And then another profile name, Alexei Chernyshov, former deputy prime minister and Zelensky's ally, accused of receiving large cash sums. He denies any wrongdoing, but Justice Minister Herman Galushenko and Energy Minister Svetlana Harenchuk were forced to resign. Public anger has exploded, and headlines have been reading about how the president's friends have been robbing the country, making him no different to Vladimir Putin. Zelensky's initial reaction was one of caution. He has expressed general support for the investigation, but stopped short of decisive action. And when the Prime Minister announced only a temporary suspension of one implicated minister, activists erupted yet again. Only after rising public pressure has Zelensky demanded resignations, removing both ministers from the National Security Council, imposed sanctions on Mindich as well as others. Now, as you can see, this is a dramatic pivot, but many say it's come too late. And there is a sense that Zelensky is chasing the scandal rather than actively on top of it or controlling it. But again, what do you think about this? Is it a bigger deal or is it actually a smaller deal and not something that's worth worrying about given the situation of the war? Let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoy deeper contextual analysis like this, then do subscribe. It's free, but really helps me be discovered and perform in the YouTube algorithm. So now let's look at what this actually does to Ukraine's politics and the wider diplomacy. Firstly, Zelensky's legitimacy is under strain already, and his numbers have dipped even more after the summer protests, and with this set of ones, they are tanking. Second, the timing is pretty dangerous. Ukraine always depends on continued Western support, social morale, and independent institutions. Even the perception of hesitation damages all three, so this is not going to help. Thirdly, political fragmentation is brewing. Opposition parties are calling for a technocratic unity government already, and they're not calling for Zelensky to step down, but no one wants a political crisis during the conflict. That pressure is building for Zelensky to be even more transparent, though, something which he has shown reluctance to do. Fourthly, new revelations may emerge. Prosecutors hinted that former Defense Minister Rustem Umerov could have been influenced by Mindich. He denies any involvements, but the fact this was said publicly is significant. If future evidence touches Zelensky's office, consequences could escalate even more sharply. And so with that in mind, let's return to how this crisis affects political stability. So what, with all this in mind, happens next? Well, let's be crucial in emphasizing that the scandal doesn't automatically weaken Ukraine. There's a difference between political issues and the military performance. Of course, you need a political centralized command structure to ensure the military performs effectively. But at this point, the Ukrainians are, say, innovating enough to even offset the issues of manpower. Not enough, as you'll see in subsequent interviews I have coming up, but the point being that the Ukrainian military is not suddenly going to be underwhelmingly or overwhelmingly affected and can still continue to defend against the Russians, albeit despite this. The biggest problem is in the psychological or propaganda area of war, the information warfare, and how the Russian side can capitalize on this to illustrate that Ukraine is just bleeding the West of its money, of its support, and making them neglect their own domestic institutions. The Russian side can benefit greatly from preying upon this and getting some of their populist mouthpieces in the West, like, say, Viktor Orban or Nigel Farage, or those who are much more sympathetic to the Russian side, to emphasize, look, Ukraine is as corrupt, if not more, than Russia. I mentioned already that Ukraine has been sitting now at around 105th in the rankings of this transparency index, and Russia, by contrast, has dipped to around 154, very notably since the full-scale invasion in 2022. That gap isn't about being culturally worse or better, as I say. It's about the institutions and the choices that political leaders make when these kind of scandals explode. Unlike Moscow, where we see a clampdown of independent media, or the sudden disappearance or someone falling out of a window when someone speaks ill of the Kremlin, these NABU and SAPU organizations are having the opposite effect, and it's being publicly reported on and dealt with, at least we hope, in effective means. The fact that they carried out a 15-month organization investigation over wartime itself speaks to the institutional resilience and growing effectiveness. But civil society wants. Presidential aligned agencies like the SBU have also been pressuring NABU before, and some have been investigating the corruption, have even been detained on what activists call politically motivated charges. Parliament will now question law enforcement agencies. Audits of energy and defence companies are already underway. And everyone knows the leadership crisis during wartime is too dangerous to imagine. But ignoring this scandal is even more dangerous for the structural disintegration it could have, which then Russia simply capitalizes on. So effectively, everything depends on whether Zelensky distances himself further from implicated allies, whether the investigation runs its full course, and whether more sensitive names emerge. And of course, all of this plays into the longer term aspirations of Ukraine to pivot, or at least under Zelensky, to pivot more to the West, to join the EU eventually, to join NATO eventually. And because of the complexities of these organizations and the need to defend, shall we say, the European project or the NATO alliance, it's why you see, despite the statements continually being reiterated that Ukraine will, like Moldova, for example, eventually join the EU, nothing actually changes in the policy standpoint, because the organizations and those who work within, of course, want to support Ukraine, but have to be aware of protecting the organizations as they exist. And whether we like it or not, Ukraine still has a lot of issues. It's still very corrupt. There's still a lot of unfortunate events happening, particularly at the lower levels, not necessarily the senior figures. This is why this is such a big deal, but particularly at the lower levels of government and officers, even in the military, for example, siphoning of weapons and ammunitions to sell off to parts of Africa even, are a huge issue. And why I, as much as I can imagine Ukraine being part of Europe or NATO at some point in the future, do not support a fast tracking, because it's unrealistic and unpractical at the moment, and would be a huge risk to the organizations themselves. And so Ukraine, with this bigger aspirations in mind, thinks about the overall cost benefit analysis, the benefits of joining the EU versus the short-term bureaucratic wins by being indulged in the corruption, right? It's ultimately the sort of moral argument as much as the pragmatic one. And we hope that these probes and events that we see coming out here do yield positive results for the country's transparency, economic stability, and political cohesion going forward. But that's it from me. If you enjoy this video, then do let me know in the comments what you'd like to see in the future, and also your thoughts. As I say, my name is Pyotr, I am half English, half Russian, and I host the Global Gambit here. Links to support me further, such as by buying me a coffee or a couple of beers, I always enjoy those, are below, or you can become more permanent supporter by being a YouTube member or a patron, where I'm increasingly releasing my own unique content, as well as full uninterrupted versions of my interviews. And I look forward to seeing you in the next one. Take care.